Hey guys, I really hope you enjoyed this clip, but before you do, please hit subscribe. How do we make an investment and what all goes into it? And we're going to talk about diligence. We're talking about Alaska. We're going to talk about how to diligence geographies and industries. But I think the first place to start, how do you know a seller's ready? Because you can burn a lot of time in this world thinking you're about to buy this business, all to get to the end in what, for most of the businesses, I imagine you're buying founder-led, family-owned, owned a long time.
Yep.
Maybe it even maybe they were committed when it started, and by the end, they're like, "This is my identity's in this."
Yep.
How have you all gotten comfortable with we think this business really is ready to sell?
Oh, well, I think there are a variety of different ways to answer this question. So first off, I think the expected answer most of the time is that you have proprietary deal flow that you can control the process with. And I think that's utter bullshit. So we have had plenty of situations where people have come to us and they said, we would like to get to know you. We may be interested in doing something. There is certainly value in having direct communication and trying to figure out a path forward. But sometimes people go fishing. And a lot of times when people reach out to us directly, they're going fishing, right? Like they're trying to figure out, is this the right time? Am I actually interested in doing this? What does it look like? We are happy to have that conversation, but we fully acknowledge that it is fishing. That is not commitment. You have not made a financial commitment to anybody to do anything. And emotionally, most of the time, if you're reaching out directly, it may mean that you haven't really involved anyone else in your life, which is different than confidentially doing a deal and is more about controlling whether or not you're committed to doing something, right? So we take that at its face value. We're happy to have the conversation. We're happy to start forming a relationship, but we do not assume that you are ready to sell, right? Being ready to sell, I think, is a path for people. And I think most sellers, when they first start talking to buyers, don't know if they're ready to sell. And sometimes people get excited about the money and still emotionally are not ready to sell, right? And so for us, it is a series of events and sort of pattern recognition along the way. So to give you specific examples, if we are talking to an advisor first about an opportunity, we want to understand how long they've known the seller and the context under which that relationship developed. And then we're trying to understand who's making decisions. So sometimes it is, the majority shareholder, but sometimes it's not. Yep. And trying to understand why that may or may not be the case and what the driving force of the transaction is, which you can suss out in a couple different ways. We end up asking questions around the transaction priorities, but also sort of life circumstance, who makes decisions, who's involved in day-to-day, really trying to make sure that all the pattern matching actually puts together a cohesive story. Because I can't tell you how many times, especially kind of 2021 to 2022, there were situations where, it's the business has reached a certain scale, they're ready for the next level, whatever that is. And then you find out that the owner is 38 and they want to sell out. And you're like, that doesn't compute for me. If this is a great opportunity, why does a 38-year-old want out? And there may be an extenuating circumstance, but we do need to understand what that is. Otherwise, we are not committed to moving forward on that deal. Yep. So it's always situationally context first. And then once we start talking to a seller directly, it really is about how they talk about the business. So, there's the cliche I versus we type stuff. And then there's how the business has developed over time, who owns relationships, and how they think about, sort of judgment within the company. If they are still very much a key man risk within the organization, that leads very naturally into a conversation of, okay, what do you think that means in terms of our ability to partner in the business, especially in a majority capacity? What happens if you lose interest when you get that check, right? What happens if your spouse is telling you to take steps back? What does that mean for us if we're going to move forward? And so it leads to a conversation that's less about are you committed or not committed, and more about an appreciation for what the transition is going to ultimately have to look like, which usually means, working at least as hard, sometimes more, not less, for some period of time to make sure that the institutional knowledge that lives within that person gets transferred into the business. And walking through that with them, and this is like pre-IOI, this is pre like even talking about valuation, helps them to appreciate what we're trying to do, right? Which is to steward a business, right? To steward their team. And they start, a lot of people, especially like on an owner level, underappreciate their own value. And so you start to highlight that for them and say, these are meaningful things we're going to have to solve for in order for you to be able to take those steps back. So we get through that. And then we are also pattern matching to, based on how they answer those questions, but also how they answer follow-ups. So we typically don't like ask quantitative questions when we're having our first phone call with an operator, because we want to stay focused on what makes it a great business and like, how do you guys make decisions? How do you think? And so then, if we have questions about specific customers or suppliers or financial questions, we'll follow that up. If we get any inkling of a response that's basically like, I want to know value first, and I'm not willing to have you holistically appreciate the nuances of the business before you designate a value to me, then we're pretty much out. And the reason why is it basically says like, I'm fishing, right, to us. It says, I'm not willing to commit to you. I'm not willing to try to build trust in your direction, but I want to know what you're going to do for me. And so for us, that just has never created a scenario that we've been successful in closing. So today we just avoid it if that's the path that's going down.
Can you just go a layer deeper, I versus we? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So, so you talk about like how a business has been built, and depending on who the owner is and how they think about the business, a lot of them were founders and a lot of them were key decision makers for a very long period and may still be. But when you start to talk about daily operations, if every answer begins with, I do this and they do this, it's effectively what you would consider a silo if you were talking about any two teams. But the issue is, in this case, the owner has the skin in the game and no one else does. So whatever the answer is, I do this. If it's consequential to risk management, to estimation, to pricing, to customer relationships, to how you recruit key talent, how you manage the team, it's a problem. Yep. Like, it's a problem from a transition standpoint if you're looking to leave. If you're not looking to leave, it's a whole different conversation of what do effective partnership dynamics look like, right? And you had Mark on, like, Mark is the GOAT in terms of trying to work with people in a coaching capacity who may have been some combination of an individual contributor and the leader of their own company, and trying to help them appreciate how to scale themselves and therefore scale the company. So when we can partner, that's great, but we have to know that the person has the attitude that they want that coaching.
This is a good time. Also, I probably should have done this at the beginning. Can you clarify what you do? We know you started finding businesses, but now this is 10 years later. Yeah.
So I'm responsible for essentially the front end of our firm.
Okay.
So I'm responsible for marketing, origination, and the deal process.
Okay.
So that means that I'm typically the person that advisors with a meaningful opportunity are going to talk to. I'm the person who talks to owners first and tries to assess whether or not we can be a good fit for the business. I make the first offer. And then if we're moving forward on that, I negotiate what you would consider to be key terms, right? So enterprise value, how much are we buying, and what the consideration set will be, how the money is delivered. And then Taylor takes over into diligence. Tim makes fund-oriented decisions, and then Mark and his team lead post-close operations.
Okay. I think that's just important for context. Yeah. Okay. And maybe
it's the only way we've been able to scale the way that we have is to think about it in that way.
And sequence.
And sort of, it's a sequence-based approach, but it allows people to stay focused on what they're best at. Like, I should really not manage, teams. Yeah. I've done it. I've done it over my career, but, in the same way I had the conversation about operating in the red not being great for me. Like, I learned a lot and I think I got better for it, but I will never be on Mark's level, and I'm okay with that.
Yep. You are what Mark calls a principal. Okay. And I don't even know. I just jumped to assumption that understanding if it's actually a willful seller might be the first thing you need to be interested. I guess the question is, when do you know this is something we're going to dig into a little bit?
I wish that I could quantify that for you. I think that it's a combination of things. So I definitely have taste on what I like to see in the value proposition of a business. So how long it's been around, who they serve, what their positioning is within the market, how they price, and how money moves through the organization are all kind of key areas on a company attributes level that I try, and somewhere in my head, I'm just like making that puzzle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then separately is the competitiveness question. So is this a company that we should be the steward of? And how should we think about that? Because people have a lot of options. They have the option to do nothing. They have the option to sell to a strategic and lose their identity. They have the option to sell to an ESOP and sell to the employees. They have an option to sell to traditional private equity, right? We are none of those things. But to the extent that those are all options, and we acknowledge that people should go explore those and appreciate them for what they are, and then figure out what serves them. But we also need to form an opinion on whether or not we can be helpful. And there are certain situations where we can be more or less helpful, especially considering what their vision from a positioning of the company is on a go-forward basis. So what I mean by that is, so to take a concrete example, food and beverage for us, most of the time is a quick no.
Okay.
Because...
Sorry, everybody.
It's a bummer for me too. We have seen a few sort of specialty foods that we have looked at pretty closely, but most food companies are structured and set up to eventually be sold to a major corporation. So everything about them is trying to achieve a certain scale, not necessarily a certain economic model in that process, in order to be attractive enough to be bought by a major corporation. And the entire industry feeds that, right? Based on like buying shelf space at grocery stores. Like it's all, kind of based on that. Everybody wants the niche brands, but those niche brands are going to have the power of major corporations behind them in order to achieve that scale. So when we see that, it's a question of like, why don't they want that? Right? If we're going to move forward, why do you not want to go down that path? And sometimes there's an incredibly intriguing situation, a desire for independence, a differentiated market that they serve, an unwillingness from a corporate standpoint to engage in the type of activity, for a variety of reasons. You can kind of go down the path of like, there are exceptions to the rule, but on average, when we see that, the ultimate goal for them is to get to scale. And the way that they do that is primarily by reinvesting heavily into manufacturing capacity and into product extension and inventory and shelf space with the intention of getting the attention of a corporation. It's not a good fit for us, right?
Got it. Yep.
Oil and gas is not a good fit for us because somebody in Texas passed on it before we ever saw it, right? And so we want to acknowledge that like we probably are not in a position to better understand the opportunity that exists there. And there are lots of specialists who probably didn't appreciate it either. And there's probably a reason for that. So, kind of having some sort of circle of competence, hubris, like we try to avoid the hubris and try and say, okay, we're just going to stay within our lane. But the same thing is true, right? So we partnered on a software business last year. None of us write code. None of us. And so my first conversation with them was, hey guys, like, what do you want help with? Because if you want help with writing code, like we can't be helpful. So the conversation was then about, that's not what we want help with, right? We want help with scaling how we approach major organizations, how we think about the structural hierarchy of our organization, how we establish incentive plans that keep people that we train here, like all of that stuff, right? It's the more detailed, nuanced, like how do you scale strategy that they wanted help with. And immediately we were like, well, we can be helpful with that. So it just depends on what people are trying to solve for.
And does that answer the question of should we be the steward of this business? I know that's probably not like that's probably a mix. You can answer that different ways, but how do you know, like, yeah, we should be the steward of this?
Yeah, I think that where I mostly get on that question, and that becomes sort of a conflicting conversation in my head, is if the opportunity feels like it's going to last for decades or not.
Yep.
And so durability really matters, pricing position really matters, and then sort of specialization of the operator matters. So like some businesses are managed by engineers, like actual accredited engineers. And so no one from our firm could step in and operate the day-to-day of that business in the same way that they could. So if you think about that, then you need redundancy to solve for that issue if you're going to be able to steward it for a long time. Or it shouldn't be something that we can be helpful on. They need to go find somebody who has similar credentials and similar capabilities in that way.
Just on a guess, how many businesses do you see before you're at least to a, maybe we should steward this? We're kind of interested.
So
I'm about to tee up a question. I'm just teeing up a question.
I probably see a couple thousand deals a year at varying stages of like teaser through, or somebody sending me an email. And we have made, I think we have put sort of structural valuations around 16 deals this year.
Sidebar question. This isn't what I was going to ask, but I think it's interesting. How many times, maybe the answer is zero, does a seller approach you maybe with that mentality of like, all I care about is price, but after meeting y'all, you show them?
It's why I want to talk to sellers really quickly.
Yep.
So advisors have their own incentive structure. Most of them are incentivized mostly to close a deal for the highest possible price because they get paid on a percentage of the deal value. So for them, we look not as attractive in a lot of cases for a lot of reasons. We have no financial contingencies and we have a very strong record of closing deals we go under LOI on. But for them, they want to chase out what they consider to be like the golden goose. If I have one good egg, I'm going to try and make sure that I get the highest possible price for it because I'm putting in the work either way. So in that, we want direct access to the owner as early as we can possibly get it to try and make sure and really to understand whether or not they have that understanding, right? Around like, okay, so are you trying to optimize for enterprise value? Are you trying to optimize for cash at close? Are you trying to optimize for your quickest exit? Are you trying to optimize for whatever it may be, right? Like just saying like, I want top dollar doesn't actually mean anything because there's still nuance to what that means at the end of the day.
But do they ever change what they're optimizing for after meeting y'all?
Yes.
Being like, oh my gosh, I never thought I could look at my business this way.
Yes.
So the answer is you can, not necessarily you're trying to change people's minds, but they might have a conversation. Y'all, maybe you don't hear from them, but they call back and they go, man, y'all said some things that nobody's ever told me.
Well, they just don't appreciate that option exists in the market
for
them, right? A lot of times it doesn't feel like it exists when you're looking at a wide swath of what feel like incredibly spreadsheet-oriented financial buyers. So if you can get away from that, then you start to talk about other operational considerations. And once they realize that they can articulate priorities in that arena and have people listen to them, it does change the way that they think about the opportunity set. It doesn't mean we win every time, because there is kind of a, I think about it in terms of like, we don't want seller's remorse. So it's protecting us as well, especially because we partner so often. But I don't want someone to do a deal with us that had a deal that was like double the value that they didn't fully evaluate.
Yep.
Because that will constantly be in the back of their head.
For sure.
Right? So when we have conversations with people, we're typically not the highest bidder, but we're typically competitive, right? And then we talk about the nuance. And the people we do best with are people who have what I refer to as engineering-oriented mindsets, in the sense that they care about the details. They care about where the money comes from. They care about the behavior of it is the way we frame it.
Yep.
How long it's available, how it treats the company, how decisions are made, like all of the dominoes that come from how you are capitalized. And so if they appreciate all of that nuance, then we tend to do pretty well, at least in being a very competitive option for them. And then it comes down to sort of like, what are the deltas, right? And our experience is that when you have deltas that are more than like 20, 25%, then our encouragement is like, go chase it out and see if it's real. Because sometimes it's real, but a lot of times it's not real. And a lot of times it's a position to move forward, to get something under LOI, to lock it up for 90 to 120 days, and to then figure out what I'm going to pay for the business, right?
Yep.
And that can be, that disillusionment for a seller causes deal fatigue, right? But we would rather them get that in the real world with other people, as opposed to us trying to educate them in the abstract and then risking them having seller's remorse later.
And one thing we talked about that really stood out that night at dinner was you look at a lot of maybe your job, the team's job early on is like, we're just question askers. We're not making any promises. Correct. We're not throwing out numbers. Correct. Like we are asking questions.
Yep.
Does that differ from a lot of other buyers? Do a lot of other buyers start promising right out the gate?
I mean, I think I have friends in traditional private equity, and they will throw around multiples a lot more commonly than we do, and they mean it. So what I mean by that, it's not actually a bad way of operating. It's more prescriptive though. So they have specific ways that they underwrite and approach different types of opportunity. So if you have a SaaS deal, we are willing to buy 75% at this multiple range, depending on if your ARR is this, or this. That's what they do. Yep. And so it's like, it's the spreadsheet talking and telling you what they will pay. Yep. And they already have like the banks lined up to provide leverage in accordance with that model. Yep. We don't have a standard model that exists for any deal. We want to understand who's selling, why they're selling, how they think about the future, what they want to benefit from in the future. We want to understand everything about the business and how cash moves through the business. We value businesses based on its cash flow, not based on like EBITDA or some other number.
What's the distinction?
So from the standpoint of discretionary cash flow is what you can buy beer with if you're an owner.
Okay. What's EBITDA?
EBITDA is something made up by accountants. So what we mean by it though, it used to be that the rough calculation was EBITDA less capital expenditures. Honestly, in the last 2 years, it's mostly been working capital adjustments in addition to CapEx that have made a real change. And so anything that was operating in just-in-time inventory over the last, kind of 10 years has made a material change in how the business is structured. And it's generally meant that part of the earnings for the year is being reinvested back into growing the inventory level in a pretty meaningful way. So then it's a question of, okay, is that sustainable now? Is it going to continue to grow on pace with growth in the company? Go down the line of trying to figure out what free cash flow actually looks like.
Why is working capital always the thing that people fight over? Like, no matter who, whether it's reading y'all's or other podcasts or listening, it's like working capital is where everybody decides to disagree.
Well, because I think that an owner often feels that it's stored value. What
do you mean by that?
It's the money that they could have taken out, but instead left in the business, right? So they think about it as stored value, and it's I totally appreciate that. But then the other side of the coin is if you take all of that out, what is the business capable of, right? Yep. So the metaphor we use is like it's a body without blood. You can't do anything with it, and it won't perform based on the historic value if it doesn't have what it had before. Okay. And so it is sometimes a conversation, right? So like working capital also moves a lot. So the seasonality of buildups of inventory, of cash, what they do with cash at the end of the year, how they think about securities. Like some people manage their personal family securities on their balance sheet. So trying to figure out if that is there for any business purpose or if it truly is personal. Those are all conversations that lead to a lot of nuance. And we've gotten to a place where, we don't make that decision upfront. That is very much a conversation. And we try to do so with an appreciation for what the business needs and how to think about positioning it so that post-close, it never feels the effect of a transaction.